I'll now introduce our speaker, and it's our own chairperson, Sarah Barr. And she's going to talk about planes, brains, and atmospheric aerosols. Now, Sarah's a PhD student in the Institute for Climate and Atmospheric Science here at Leeds, completed a degree in environmental science at Lancaster University, followed by a master's in atmospheric and climate science at ETH in Zurich. This research focused on meteorology in the context of snow cover modelling and snow hydrology. She started a PhD in 2018 and now investigates ice formation in clouds, specifically in higher altitude regions, using a combination of field work, lab work, and modelling. Now, ice-nucleating particles, abbreviated to INPs, they play a crucial role in the climate system due to their influence on ice formation, cloud lifetime, and precipitation. This is especially important in high latitude regions where mixed phased clouds are common. So Sarah will discuss the role of INPs and findings from recent field and lab studies, including on the FAAM research aircraft. And for those of you who have been here before will probably recognize the FAAM aeroplane, converted BA 146, and FAAM stands for Facility for Airborne Atmospheric Measurements. So after that mouthful, I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thanks, John. You've done my introduction. I can skip the first few slides. But yes, thanks. It's nice to be here in person. And as John says, I've been the chairperson for nearly a year, but this is our first actual in-person event, so it's really nice to see some of you in person. Those of us on the committee haven't actually met before this evening, so it's all very exciting. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to my PhD and the work I've been doing in the last 3.5 years. It's going to be a bit more of a why and a how kind of talk and a bit of results at the end, if I speak quick enough. But stick with the first. We've got a whole range of people in the audience today, ranging from my mum and dad to Mark, who knows more of this than I do. So I'm going to start with the basics. Can somebody tell me when water freezes, what temperature water freezes?
0 Celsius at standard temperature or pressure and
Wrong. Sorry, Dave, that's wrong.
Well,
we've all been taught that, that water freezes at 0 degrees, and in many cases it does, but there are lots of situations when water doesn't freeze at 0 degrees. I'm going to prove it with this beer, which is alcohol free, so it's basically water. So you see, when we first pour the beer, it's liquid, and as soon as it hits the glass, it freezes. So this is a beer I put in the freezer with the lid on, so now it's liquid, and now it's frozen. So this beer is super cooled, so it's basically below 0 degrees, so it hasn't frozen at 0. And this is important because in the atmosphere, water can exist in this super cooled state to really low temperatures, as low as -38, if it's basically completely pure water. But at warmer temperatures, particular aerosol particles, known as INPs, kindly introduced by John, can trigger freezing, and this can happen at different temperatures. And as you can see from this diagram on the left, this ice formation occurs by different pathways. So it can happen the liquid forms first and then this freezes, or it can happen that ice forms directly from the vapor phase to the ice. But what I'm most interested in and what we're going to talk about today is immersion freezing. And this is when you have a liquid cloud droplet forming. So you have a CCN, which is a cloud condensation nuclei. Liquid droplet forms and then it freezes or it cools until the INP triggers the freezing. And these this sort of pathway is particularly important for mixed phase clouds. So this is when you've got a cloud that's got liquid and ice together. And to understand why that's important, we need to go back a bit to the basics of clouds. So I'm sure you'll know that cloud forms when you get when the atmosphere is saturated and you get water vapor. That's pretty basic. And the point this happens, so when you get saturation at the saturation, saturation vapor pressure is the point where water vapor is in equilibrium with its condensed state. So water and liquid are in this equilibrium state.
Sarah, can you stay near the microphone?
Yes, I can. And if the vapor pressure exceeds this saturation vapor pressure, then you can get condensation. And as you can see from this plot, this saturation vapor pressure is a function of temperature. So just to go into a bit more detail, this blue line is where we have saturation. So at this point, the kind of water vapor and the liquid are in equilibrium. The vapor pressure is equal to the saturation vapor pressure, and the evaporation and condensation are the same. So our liquid, if we have it, will just be there existing in equilibrium. If we're in this regime here, the atmosphere is subsaturated, so the vapor pressure is less than saturation and evaporation is greater than condensation. So the liquid will evaporate. And if we have a cloud droplet, it will eventually disappear. And here, where it's supersaturated, the vapor pressure is greater than saturation, so condensation is greater than evaporation, and our droplets will grow. So that's kind of the basics. But what you'll notice is that these temperatures we're talking about are below zero. And what we've just learned is that in this situation, we could either have liquid water or we could have ice. So it gets a bit more interesting when you look at the ice and the water together, because the vapor pressure of ice is lower than of liquid water. So we can have this situation in this gray area where the atmosphere is supersaturated with respect to the ice, but subsaturated with respect to the water. So then in a mixed phase cloud, where you have liquid and ice together, basically the vapor pressure is greater than saturation for the ice, but lower than saturation for the water. So our liquid will evaporate and our ice will grow. So now we can see that in a mixed phase cloud, as soon as you have ice forming, the whole dynamics of the situation can change. So then that brings us to the importance of INPs themselves, because this supercooled liquid cloud might be existing quite happily in equilibrium, and then either it will cool slightly further or something will trigger the formation of ice. So we have these INPs, and then our ice is formed, begins growing, the liquid evaporates until the ice is large enough to precipitate. And then this obviously has a knock-on effect on our cloud lifetime, on the precipitation formation, and on the radiative properties of the cloud, partly because it might disappear, but also liquid clouds and ice clouds have a different albedo. So this is a classic example. If you've ever seen a talk of anyone about ice-nucleating particles, this picture will be in there. And what's happening here is that around the edge is supercooled liquid. Something has triggered the ice formation in the middle, and the ice has grown, so it's falling out, but you can see those streaks. And the water is evaporated, which is why you get this hole. So that's basically ice nucleation in action. And this is important now, but also when we start thinking about the future, clouds with more liquid have a higher albedo, so they're more reflective. And as the climate warms, ice in clouds is going to be replaced by more liquid, which will be a bit controlled by the ice nucleating particles, which will lead to more reflective clouds. So you have this negative feedback because they have a cooling effect. But this feedback is going to depend on the amount of ice in the clouds now and in the future, but there's a lot of uncertainty in modeling clouds and aerosols and in the ice formation. So we need to understand this whole process a bit better, both the actual kind of fundamental nucleation, but also the ice nucleating particles themselves, so we can improve current and future climate predictions. So I've talked a lot about INPs, but not anything about what they are. And they're basically a subset of atmospheric aerosols, which can be made up of desert dust, bacteria, viruses we now know a lot about, I think, fortunately, fungal spores, ash, pollen, other types of ash, and marine biogenics. So this is things like phytoplankton that can be emitted from the sea surface. And all of these can act as ice nucleating particles. We know that desert dust in particular is one of the most important partly because it's very prevalent and it's also quite sort of active. So I'm sure you remember a few weeks ago, this big Saharan dust event that we had. So that sort of thing happens quite often, but even when you can't see these big events, there's a lot of emissions of desert dust. But there's still a lot that we don't know. So these particles are quite rare. Concentrations tend to be about 1 per litre. So that's much less than cloud condensation nuclei, for example. There's a lack of observations. There's also a lack of instruments that can make observations. So we really don't have a very good understanding of the distribution and kind of seasonal cycles of these particles and how they interact with the clouds. And this is particularly the case in high latitude. So basically anything north of about 50 degrees north or south of 50 degrees south. And in these areas, you get a lot of mixed phase clouds, which can be quite supercooled because it's cold, obviously, but there tend to be less aerosols, so they can exist for quite a long time in this supercooled state. And low latitude aerosol sources can be less dominant, but there's local sources that might contribute to the local INP concentrations. So they're very rare. We can't see them. We can't measure them. We don't know where they are, and we don't know how to measure them. So what do we do about that? First, you find a poor PhD student who thinks it's a great idea to do this. That's me. Then there's 2 ways to go about it. The first is to measure INPs in the atmosphere and try and work out where they've come from. And the second is to find possible sources and see where they go. So I'm going to talk a bit about both of these if I have time. And the first one, as John said, we're lucky here in the UK to have access to this facility for airborne atmospheric measurements, the FAAM research aircraft. And this plane is based at Cranfield University and has the facility for measuring all sorts of atmospheric properties, atmospheric chemistry, physics, cloud properties, aerosols, and it goes all over the world at different times. So during my PhD, I've been involved in 2 FAAM field campaigns, the first in Scotland in 2019 and the second in Sweden last 2 months ago. It was supposed to be in 2020, it was not. And both of these focused on measuring aerosols and cloud properties in cold air outbreaks. So this is when you have air from the north traveling southwards and the clouds sort of develop in that system. So this is just an example of a flight we did in Sweden. So you can see our altitude here is 100 meters, which is here over the ice and that one over the sea. So we basically can do the whole atmosphere, and these sort of sawtooth things are going through different cloud layers. So we sample aerosol onto filters on the aircraft using this inlet system. So it's pretty simple. There's an inlet on the outside of the aircraft that you can open. Air comes through and through a filter, which I have one here. Here's one I prepared earlier. They're basically Teflon filters, a very, very expensive fancy coffee filter, but the pore size is 0.4 microns. I don't know where the camera is for the people online. Here it is. So the air comes through, passes through this, and that's basically it. Pretty simple. And there's also other instruments on board to measure size distribution, cloud droplets, things like that. So once we have our aerosol on our filter, hopefully, you usually can't tell. Sometimes you go places and it's really dusty and you can see that you've sampled something. Other times they just look like that. You're like, well, I don't know what's here. But then back in the lab, we use a cold stage freezing experiment using the University of Leeds microliter nucleation by immersed particle instrument, which is so catchy. And basically what this involves is adding supercool, ultra pure water to our sample, either directly onto the filter like this one, or by washing the sample off into suspension. and then freezing it. And the assumption is that this ultra pure water has no other particles that would nucleate the ice. So all the freezing is as a result of what we've sampled. So basically, this is some shots from this camera. We have the slide here with the droplets on it of our sample, and then we decrease the temperature and record the droplets freezing. And then from there, you can work out a fraction of frozen droplets. So this is just at each temperature, the percentage of the droplets that are frozen. And then you can get to an INP concentration per litre. So this is kind of what we've been hoping to get to give us a better understanding of these ice processes. But we still don't know anything about the composition or the sources. And so we don't really have any indication of what controls nucleation. So we also look at the kind of characterizing these aerosols using SEM, so a scanning electron microscope. And this gives us a size resolved composition. So the image on the far left, or right, if you're online, maybe, not sure. It's basically in each size range what percentage of different minerals are present. And in this image here, these black dots are the pores in the filter, and the white ones are the aerosols. And sometimes you see things like these middle ones are not from my work, but from another paper, but they're mostly pollen. So they're much bigger, and you can sometimes see those. So this gives us a bit of an idea of what we've sampled and what might be controlling the nucleation. And then to think about possible sources, we use a dispersion model, which simulates transport of gases and aerosols. So you basically release a number of particles from a particular point and either follow them forwards in time or backwards in time. So to look at the dispersion from a source or to determine your sources. So from these aircraft measurements, we use FlexPart, this model in backward mode, and each release location represents a measurement site. So you're basically saying, if I've released 10,000 particles at this point, where have they come from? And you end up with something like this, which is a emission sensitivity. So it's basically in time. So it gives you the residence time in the grid boxes. So it gives you a bit of an idea of where emissions from your particular measurement site would have come from. So that's one way of going about it. As I said at the beginning, we've got another option as well. I don't know what time I started, but I keep going. As I mentioned before, in the high latitudes, there's quite a lot of local dust sources. These contribute something like 5% to the global dust budget, which might not seem like very much, but in some regions, especially in the boundary layer, these could be the dominant aerosol source. So these sort of local dust sources might be important for ice nucleation, but we haven't got many measurements or observations. So I focused on a particular region in the south coast of Alaska. So it's about 60 degrees north. So just not quite in, well, it depends on the definition of Arctic, but it's not in the Arctic Circle, but it's definitely high latitude. And I'm looking at whether this dust is transported to regions where it could be an important INP. And these images at the bottom are dust events. It's a bit hard to see in here, but this is dust. So it's a large glacial river which transports a lot of sediment, which is then deposited and emitted certain times of the year. And this is a video from when I was there. Shame we don't have the sound because it's really loud, but you can see that it's just windy, dusty. It gets a bit dark, but our instruments down there somewhere. So basically I came home from there and there was dust in my ears, in my shoes, everywhere. But while we were there, we did it's a similar idea to on the aircraft, but at the surface. Again, sampling onto filters, but this time we had a sort of size resolved aerosol sample. So we're interested in whether different sizes contribute more to the INP population, and especially because the smaller particles are transported further in the atmosphere, so we want to see the differences there. So we use the multi-stage cascade impactor, which samples in from the top and then splits the aerosols onto 4 stages. Again, onto filters, I brought one, but it's smaller. So, oh, it's very fiddly. Well, you can see it there. And so we went there and during a very dusty period in October and did 7 days of sampling. We also collected some surface samples just to allow a bit of extra analysis, which is here. So the interesting thing about this glacial dust is that it's very fine. So it means it stays in the atmosphere for a long time and it's transported quite far. So this has been sieved to 45 microns, but our sample goes down to 0.2 microns. So you can imagine how much smaller. Please don't drop that because it will go everywhere and never leave the room. So that's just scooped off the floor basically, and then separated, but not separated as small as our sampler. So we basically do the same thing here, but because we're at the source, we don't really want to know so much about the INP concentration because you can imagine that it's going to sort of spread out and not really be representative of the atmosphere. So we instead use a value of NS, which is the active site density. So it's how many freezing sites there are in our sample, normalized to the surface area. So that means that it's not dependent on how much we've sampled. So that if we have some sample from somewhere else, we can compare the two quite easily because it doesn't matter how much there is. So from this, we can compare different samples and also develop parameterizations relating the ice-nucleating activity to the surface area. But again, we still don't know anything about the composition or the source. Well, we do in this case, we know about the source, but not where it's going to go. So we couldn't do SEM this time, so we used XRD instead, which is a similar kind of thing. Again, you end up with the mineral composition, so you can compare with parameterizations. And also, if you think back to my types of INP slide, many of them, or quite a lot of INPs are biogenic, so bacteria, pollen, and there's this assumption that they're heat sensitive, so they deactivate by heating. So one thing you can do to identify what's in your samples is to heat them. And you can see from this plot that these have deactivated, suggesting that there's something biogenic. So this is just another way that we try and identify what's in the samples and what's controlling the nucleation. And then once again, we use flex parts of this model, but this time going forwards in time. So emitting a certain amount of dust from a site and then trying to model where it goes. And you can basically release particles. That's a satellite picture, nothing to do with the model, I just thought it looked nice. But then you can use these model concentrations to estimate your INP concentrations. So we had this mystery box at the beginning, and I've sort of explained a few methods that we try and identify it. So you'd like to think that we'd know something more, but actually in the box it's just more questions. But I do have some. It's a bit of a work in progress, and we still have a lot to find out. But from my initial findings on the aircraft, we found that we get considerable variability in INP concentrations, even in quite a small area and from one day to the next, which suggests that depending on the sort of synoptic situation, you get that different sources might be more dominant than others. So the plot at the top is also comparing to literature data sets. So the grey top one is INP concentrations from rainfall. And a lot of my data falls The top one is from Scotland and the bottom one is from Sweden. A lot of the data falls quite below this, so quite low concentrations, which is what you expect in the Arctic or in these sort of more remote high latitude regions. But there are some that are unexpectedly high, and we haven't quite worked out why this is yet. But a lot of the samples seem to be dominated by mineral dust, and there's possibly some relation between the proximity to land. So samples where the back trajectories travel a lot over land seem to have a much higher INP activity, suggesting there are sources, for example, in the north of Scotland or other northerly regions. But this is still a work in progress. So the last field campaign was only in March, and Erin's doing most of the work there. So you can ask him if you have any questions. And then looking at the data from Alaska, the XRD shows 9% feldspar. So feldspar is one of the main components of desert dust, and we know it's a very active ice-nucleating particle. So what you would expect that if you have this in an aerosol sample, it's quite likely to control the nucleation. But as you can see from the sort of dotted lines over there, it doesn't quite match, especially the larger sizes. So this shows that these high latitude dusts are quite different to the low latitude ones, and we can't just assume that it's all the same and use the same like parameters and things like that. And plots here, but the main thing to know is that all of them were deactivated by heating. So these are each of the different size bins and all of the samples from each of those. And you can see in less so at the smaller sizes, but in most of them, they are deactivated by heating, suggesting there's something biological controlling the nucleation, which this is again quite different to what you get in desert dust and more low latitude mineral dust sources. And then the model results, so there's just a small video there showing the output from a model run over 5 days, emitting 5 kilotons of dust. And you can see that it's transported over a relatively large area. And I don't have the altitude plot here, but it's up to kind of 2,000 meters. So lots of model or previous studies have shown that this high latitude dust often doesn't leave the boundary layer, so it doesn't go very high, but that's quite different to what I've found. So I'm still working a bit on this, but it's interesting to see that it is transported quite far and you get quite high concentrations over quite a large area. So this, especially because of the temperature regime we're in, this could be quite an important source of INPs. And also it's not the only one in the area, so the whole south coast of Alaska and Canada and other regions have these kind of smaller dust sources. This just shows that we need to start trying to do some more measurements and also incorporate them in modeling a bit, if possible. So that's it. I'll leave that there and happy to have any questions.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Very interesting, even if some of that or a lot of that is beyond our immediate comprehension in terms of exactly what happens. One question I have is that you've got samples taken in on board the aeroplane, which you then analyse in the way that you described. Are there any other methods for obtaining samples?
Yes, there are. So this is obviously kind of an offline method where you get your sample and take it home. Not home, but I mean, yeah, I've had them in my freezer at home, but there are different ways. So you can do it with an expansion chamber. So this is where you have we have one here in Leeds. Actually, it's basically a tank, and the air samples in the top or the bottom, and then it's sealed, but then the pressure is reduced. So this simulates what happens when a particle of air is being lifted in the atmosphere. So the pressure reduces, the temperature reduces until you get a cloud forming inside the chamber. So, and then you can count the number of ice particle crystals at the bottom. So, and then assuming one ice crystal is one ice-nucleating particle, then you have your INP concentration. So there's a few different like ways of doing it like that, like a sort of cloud chamber type thing. And there's a lot of methods very similar. Lots of groups and people are doing similar sort of filter sampling to what we do, but there's a slight variability in it.
Any more questions?
Strictly 100% layman's question is, where's it all going? What's it for? Not saying anything with a derogatory, but where's it going?
So at the moment, most climate and weather models don't have ice-nucleating particles in them. So the ice just switches on at set temperature, which isn't, in many cases that's okay, but it basically isn't representative of what's really happening. So there's lots of cases where, for example, in the Southern Ocean, where there's very few INPs, often the ice processes are modeled too actively. So you end up with too much ice, and then your clouds dissipate too quickly. But there's so few measurements that we can't really say how to prove it. So there's lots of work. I don't really do any modeling, but there's also a lot of work into improving the modeling side of these ice processes. But to work out how the modeling should be done, you need the observations first. So it's all kind of eventually trying to feed into improving our understanding, but then also the climate and weather models.
Right.
Hopefully.
I was wondering who you're going to give it to when you finish that sort of make use of it.
I mean, a lot of it will be used here in Leeds. So there's a lot of people here doing climate modelling, but I also work with the Met Office. So lots of the field campaigns were with the Met Office, the last two that I did. So there's a connection there.
We have a question online. Isabella asks, are the aerosols washed down to Earth when it rains or snows? If the aerosols do not cause nucleation clouds followed by precipitation, do they stay in the atmosphere for a long time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends on the size of them, which is one reason why we want to look at the size resolved. Kind of composition. So you do get deposition if it rains, so wet and dry deposition. So even aerosols that haven't been involved in the cloud processes can be washed out by rain or snow. Dry deposition is basically gravity. So depending on the size of the particle, they can stay around for longer, and depending on how high they get first. But the very small particles can stay in the atmosphere for weeks at a time. Yeah.
IPMs you've been talking about. Surely a massive volcanic eruption could really have huge impacts on the concentration across the whole globe.
Yes.
Is anyone model the effects of volcanic eruptions?
Yes, there was somebody in our group that did a lot of work on volcanic ash, and two things actually. So volcanic ash, it can either be resuspended. So if it gets to the ground, it can stay there and then be resuspended. And somebody in our group has shown that that's quite an active and important aerosol. But from volcanic eruptions themselves can be important in particular because a big eruption, it will be kind of injected really high into the atmosphere, which means it goes really far and can stay for a really long time. And somebody in our group has been working on the kind of aging processes. So volcanic ash is a mineral, really. It's not like combustion ash, it's rocks, but it goes through a whole aging process in the volcanic plume because there's it's very acidic. So there are people working on it. It's not something I know very much about, but it's definitely a consideration, quite important.
This flex bar model, can you talk a bit about sort of where that's come from, what it uses to create the models, and where else it's used?
Yeah. So there's various different types of this sort of model that look at transport of emissions. Lots of them started from nuclear power stations and nuclear warfare. So modelling emissions from nuclear fallout, nuclear accidents and that sort of thing. And this one uses, so obviously it needs a meteorological input, and if you're going forward in time, then it uses a forecast, and if it goes backwards in time, it uses reanalysis data, which is basically a model output that's been adjusted with observations. So it takes that meteorological output and then uses the wind, the precipitation, the cloud to work out where your particles have been or are going to go. But there's various different models doing similar things, but I think they all came from nuclear.
Oh, I guess the fact
That's a good question, Josh. I mean, it's not modeling. It's never. It's like you're trying to predict the future. Right? It's not ever going to be 100%, and it depends what meteorology input you use, because they're all at different resolutions. So you're looking at grid boxes. I think it basically splits up the world into grid boxes, and I think the data I've used is 0.25 degrees. So any process that's smaller than that box isn't going to be represented very well. So you have to take it. You have to take all of it with pictures, not really. But for what I do, I'm not necessarily needing to know exactly the concentration of dust at a particular point. It's more general. I would like to know where this is maybe going to go in a broad sense. So it is enough. There are better models, and also it's like it's not really an aerosol model. So the things it's modeling are like actually bits of air that have aerosol properties rather than aerosols. There are better aerosol models. Erin can tell you all about them that do much more complicated things with the aerosols and the clouds and meteorology. So this is basic, but enough.
It's enough for us.
Yeah. For me as well.
Another question from online. Are aerosols more concentrated along weather fronts than in continuous clouds that are not associated with currents?
Don't think so. I would say not, because the concentrate. I mean, if you've got a front that's got a lot of precipitation associated with it, then you might have a lot of wet deposition, so your aerosols will be washed out. That's possible, and they might affect the transport. So for example, the video I showed, that dust, you could see it's sort of spiraling a bit because it gets involved in the weather system. So it does affect the transport, but in terms of the concentration itself, yeah, so this one gets involved in the weather system, which is why it spins like that. I suppose the concentrations and the transport depend on the emissions first, but also the deposition and things like that. So it could be different.
Okay, another question from the chat. Do aircraft exhausts add a large number of aerosols?
Yes, they do. I don't have a number, but they do. Interestingly, anthropogenic aerosols aren't very good INPs generally. So for what I do, not interested, but yes, they do. Any more?
Any more?
No. No. Yeah. It's a complicated subject. And therefore, we probably haven't got the full range of questions that if we got a bit more knowledge on.
Some good
the basic
questions
stuff.
there, I thought.
But fascinating research, and presumably, as you say, fed into the climate model, so it will hopefully reduce the uncertainties in the areas, particularly for the Arctic and Antarctic regions,
Yeah,
which is where climate change is having a very significant effect.
exactly.
So it's an important area. Now being introduced to. I won't say we are now all knowledgeable about, but nevertheless, that was a very good effort to try and put the subject into context for us. So thank you very much, Sarah, for that. And perhaps you'd like to join me in